Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining Freedom of the Press Foundation for today's event. My name is Ryan Rice. I'm the membership coordinator, and today's webinar is titled Behind the Headlines, Victims of Newsroom Raids in Marion and Tampa Tell Their Stories. This session is being recorded and will be available in FPF's events archive in the next few days. I believe the Q&A and chat windows are both available. I'll be monitoring them both to queue up your questions at the end of our discussion. We're joined today by FPF's Director of Advocacy, Seth Stern, and special guests Eric Meyer and Tim Burke. Thank you all for being here. Seth, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And thanks, Ryan, for all your help putting this together, and to our guests, of course. I'm Seth Stern. I'm the Director of Advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. For those not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and empowering public interest journalism. That includes advocating for journalists' rights at both the local and national level, but it also includes other components like operating the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a searchable database of press freedom violations all over the United States, developing technologies like Secure Drop and Danger Zone to allow journalists to securely and confidentially receive records from sources online, and providing training and resources to news outlets and independent journalists around the world to improve their digital security practices. Today, as Ryan said, we're joined by Eric Meyer and Tim Burke. Eric is the publisher of the Marion County Record in his hometown of Marion, Kansas. He's a longtime journalist and has served as a journalism professor and associate dean at University of Illinois. As many of you who have followed the news know, on August 11th this year, the Marion County Record's newsroom, as well as Eric's home, were raided by police who claimed to be investigating whether the paper violated Kansas identity fraud laws when a reporter used a government website to confirm a news tip about a local restaurant owner's driving record. Eric's 98-year-old mother, Joan, who was home at the time of the raid and gave police officers quite an earful, died the next day, likely from the stress. The raid sparked a national outrage, and the warrant that authorized it was quickly withdrawn, but as I'm sure Eric will tell us, that's far from the end of the story. And Tim Burke is also a longtime journalist. I'll let him talk more about his background and some of the really interesting and significant work he's done during his career. On May 8th of this year, FBI agents raided Tim's home newsroom, seized computers, phones, hard drives, and notes, and the ongoing investigation is over whether Tim somehow violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in obtaining outtakes of Tucker Carlson's interview with Kanye West, which he obtained from a website. Freedom of the Press Foundation led a letter with 50 or so press freedom and civil liberties organizations asking the Department of Justice to clarify what exactly they believe Tim did wrong to spark this investigation. As of yet, we have not received a response. So thanks so much for both of you for joining us today. Eric, let's start with you. Everyone here, I would assume, has read what happened in the raid back in August when it was covered in the New York Times and Washington Post and pretty much anywhere else you can think of. But a lot has happened since it left the headlines. Can you just talk at a high level about where things stand today?
Well, there have been two special prosecutors appointed, county attorneys in different counties of Kansas, one looking into whether an identity fraud ever occurred, the other looking into what was done by the authorities in response to that. I was just interviewed for the first time. Law enforcement has never interviewed me until Friday. It was Colorado Bureau of Investigation agents who did it, acting as independents. The most recent developments, the Kansas Commission on Judicial Conduct reviewed the practices of the magistrate judge who approved the search warrants originally and made a recommendation to her that in the future she should allow sufficient time to review documents before signing them, but decided that that didn't mean that she was incompetent. We actually don't get to even vote on her retention because she's from a different county and only the other county gets to vote on her. Been a lot of revelations as we've been getting body cam footage and so on. The man who was a year ago now was number 5 in a 5-man police department and is now the interim police chief, wanted to file charges against my 98-year-old mother for shoving her walker up against somebody in the middle of this raid that went on. We've basically been still struggling to come back together. The outpouring of support for us has been wonderful, but it overwhelmed our ability to handle it. We lost a reporter because of it. We were already looking for a second reporter, another reporter to hire. So we've got 2 vacancies and no applications. And we're struggling to get along. Truth of the matter is, it was pretty easy to put out the paper the first week without any equipment. We just run on adrenaline. Now the adrenaline's gone, and we are fighting tooth and toenail each week just to get the paper out.
Must be tough to balance being the news, having to cover the story of what happened to you, as well as having to cover Marion County. How are you going about that?
Well, it's weird. I mean, writing stories where you're by Eric Meyer, and it says Eric Meyer was asked this, and whatever. It's kind of strange. But there's only really 2 of us here now who write stories, and the other one, Phyllis Zorn, has been suffering. She suffered from a seizure disorder to begin with. She had a seizure right after this raid from the stress of it, and hasn't been 100% herself since then. Our coverage has suffered. I'll be the first. We have gone. There have been many stories that we, absent this having happened, we would have gone after. Not necessarily the chilling effect of it so much as just the staff effect, but there's a chilling effect too. I received a copy of the letter from the Commission on Judicial Conduct. Actually, I got it from 2 different sources. But it's all attached with you cannot release this. This is private information, whatever else. Now, the sources were willing to give it to us. And before this raid, I would have just automatically said, oh, okay, well, the source gave it to us. It's a big deal. If somebody told them they shouldn't have released it, that's their problem. This time I asked a lawyer before I would release the thing. And that sort of situation really is going on quite a bit. We're afraid that when all this is over, we're absolutely convinced that everything's going to turn out in our side, that this was a political attempt to silence us and the vice mayor, and that it really had nothing to do with any crime violations, that they overdid everything, that we're going to prove this. But when all is said and done, we're going to be the jerks that somehow bankrupted the city and gave it a bad name, and it's going to be our fault. But anybody in the media knows that whatever you report becomes your fault, whether you did it or not. But it's worrisome, because that was the whole reason I came back here. The whole reason I originally bought this place 20 some years ago, before I ever came back, was to try to support the community. And if we effectively destroy the community, either by reputation or by bankrupting it with the settlement, that's not what I wanted to do.
Quickly, and speaking about the community's reputation, there were, in the aftermath of the raid, there seemed to be a lot of speculation that the raid was the product of sort of long simmering community tensions over your aggressive style of reporting, I guess, relative to other small town papers. But with everything that's come out about the police chief in particular since then, it sort of makes the issue seem smaller than that. It was a political grudge by one or a few individuals, at least the way that I'm perceiving it. What's your take on that? Is it a community issue, or is it a few crooked public officials?
The answer to that is yes. We've got some documentary crews that are trying to sell all sorts of things, including scripted rights to this story. And they love it. They think it'd be a wonderful Netflix series, because there's so many theories of the crime, of why they did it, and so many different individuals who sort of came together. It was a perfect storm. The police chief thought we had information against him. And I don't know whether he was worried that we had the information and he wanted it so much that he wanted to punish us for getting it. The mayor, we're trying to get that proven. And actually, I think that we have some good chances now that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation is in on it. They seem to be leaning in the same direction that we are, that believes that there was a political influence coming into this that coalesced with that. I think it's a little bit of all those things, but ultimately I'm the big dog and you're not in their way of thinking. And one of the trends that's going on in society is that people are okay with that. Now, not the ones that have written us, but a great number of people are, I heard something on NPR a week or so ago that said that people are really want authoritarian rule. They want people to come out and just, it doesn't matter if you violate the law, you just go ahead and take control of the situation and get something done. Well, they took control of the situation and tried to get something done. You add that to the fact that there's just basic out and out incompetence. I mean, this is Marion, Kansas. You're not going to have, the star play. If this were a football team, we're not going to bring in Patrick Mahomes. We're going to bring in some lesser quarterback than that. That, just to tell you whether this is stopped or not, that's a Kansas City TV station calling me about comment on this story. That the phone never stops ringing around here. It really is incompetence, malice, willingness to just accept orders. There's a fair number of people who, oh, you said you wanted this, and so we'll give it to you. We don't make waves, don't rock the boat. That's sort of a mantra around public officials here. And even if they opposed it, they just, well, I didn't want to get in trouble, So all those different things come together. The proximate cause, the one that really put them over the line, though, I believe, is the political motivations. But that's neither here nor there.
Thanks, Eric. And Tim, let's talk about what happened with you a bit. First, let's talk about your background. You're not exactly a conventional journalist, but you've broken some really significant stories. Can you talk a bit more about what you do and your approach to gathering the news, and specifically online news gathering?
Sure. Well, my background is actually, I grew up in rural Northwest Ohio, working as a journalist through high school as a stringer for our newspaper and as the other journalist at our town radio station. So I have an incredible amount of respect for Eric and, the work that he's trying to do, because, as somebody who's married to a Tampa City Councilwoman, whether it's New York City or Tampa or Marion or Napoleon, Ohio, the decisions that affect people's lives, are made by their municipal governments, and media outlets need to cover those municipal governments so people know how those decisions are being made. And that's how I got started in this. And I went to journalism school at Ohio University, and then I ended up teaching college for 10 years. That's how I ended up here in Tampa to do my PhD at the University of South Florida. But that bug was always there to get back into journalism. And I got the opportunity to join the staff of Deadspin, where I worked for, I guess, 7 years, publishing mostly video work, but doing some investigative stuff. Obviously, the story about Manti Te'o and the fake dead girlfriend is the most prominent one. But I always really even that story, I always looked at myself as a media reporter, as somebody who looks at news through the lens of how it's delivered to people. And that sort of is what led me to, the viral video about Sinclair Broadcast Group and the, extremely dangerous to our democracy viral video from about 5 years ago. And then, after that, I left to be the video director at the Daily Beast. And then, I'd wanted to go solo for a long time. I felt like the things that I knew how to do were really going to be necessary for me to help get new news organizations, and especially new local and state news organizations, off the ground. And that's what I've dedicated the last 5 years of my life to doing. In addition to being a freelancer, writing for Slate and the Washington Post and my local weekly newspaper, I've been, contributing to a lot of other places, but primarily working with new news outlets in Chicago, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Virginia, Arizona, North Carolina, Recount Media, Courier, Newsroom, teaching them the skills that I developed over all those years of being able to monitor many, many different news sources for breaking news, identifying how it's happening, and the best ways to report that through social media. So I'm very much, while I come from a sort of traditional media background, I sort of oriented myself very early on toward being a digital journalist, and the idea that you can create a newsroom anywhere with the right abilities, the right training. And part of what brought us back to Tampa was, we had the right property here that had a separate building for me to use as my newsroom, and that has been, the site of most of the things that I'm really proud of accomplishing, whether it be things that I published on social media, or things that I did at Deadspin or the Daily Beast, or with any of these other organizations that I've partnered with. And it's all happened from, right here in this room, in the backyard of a bungalow in Tampa, Florida.
Getting to the raid of your home newsroom, I think the raid in Marion obviously was very well known, made headlines for quite some time. Yours got some press at first, but some in the audience might not be as familiar with it. Can you talk about the story that led to the raid and the raid itself, and just sort of fill everyone in on what happened?
Sure. So the raid happened at 6 a.m. on May 8th, Monday morning. I was woken with pounding on the door. We're foster volunteers for the Tampa Bay Beagle Rescue, and our foster dog was going crazy. I honestly thought they were going to shoot the dog. I was terrified. I didn't know what this was in regard to. They said they had a search warrant. I asked to see the search warrant. They wouldn't show it to me for about 20 minutes or a half hour. They finally did, show me what that was, and just barely trying to parse it and piece through, and what could this possibly be in regard to violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or wiretapping. I've never done any of these things. What could this possibly be about? And fortunately, through a big supporter of my wife's political career, we do know a local ACLU lawyer who connected me with my personal local attorney, Mike Maddox. And he was able to speak with the prosecutor and figure out that this was about the Vice story from last November, revealing what Fox News had cut out of its Tucker Carlson interview with the artist formerly known as Kanye West, and those video clips revealing that Fox News specifically cut out all of his anti-Semitic remarks. And instead of taking those remarks, and that's the news story, this guy is a violent, anti-Semite, they covered it up, and that it was with regard to how I had acquired those materials. And to be very straightforward, all of these materials in question were acquired from a publicly available source. They were publicly broadcast. Anybody who had the link to watch it could have watched it along with me while it was happening. And that's essentially all we know. A big difference between my case and Eric's is, in his case, they were required to reveal the contents of the affidavit, which showed the motivation and the course. And, now they can, try to get some justice as to the insanity that led to that raid happening. And in my case, we don't have that recourse because the government has refused to reveal any details that were from that affidavit that led to the search warrant being approved. And you know, in other cases, you know, like the flyer for this very event has an image from a security camera. So we have video proof of what happened in Marion. And in my case, when the federal agents arrived at my home, they actually cut the wires to my security cameras. So I don't have even that evidence. What I do have is what I know, you know, what they took. And you know, the search warrant authorized them to take a very specific time span and very specific materials just related to this one alleged violation of the hacking law. What they took instead was everything. They took reporters' notebooks that have memorialized conversations of mine with confidential sources, some highly sensitive. We know that they accessed my direct messages and text messages with confidential sources in violation of Florida's SHIELD law. And, you know, we suspect that they didn't follow any elements of the Privacy Protection Act, but we can't impeach that because we haven't been given any access to the courts. We don't have the affidavit, and we haven't been granted any access to even a hearing to ask why these things were taken, why they haven't been returned. It's been 7 months now. And, you know, I wasn't working the previous 6 months leading up to this because I was running my wife's election campaign, which the election was just 10 days before the raid. So, you know, I was just getting back into, you know, getting ready to go back to my proper career as a journalist when this all happened. And then since then it's been 7 months and we haven't heard anything. And I think that's why my case has gotten so much, you know, less attention, is because there's no record of it. There's barely any record of it even happening. The government's refusing to say anything about it, except for what they've told my attorneys in their private conversations.
And let me just say that everything that they did to Tim, they tried to do to us. But you know, when we went over and asked for the probable cause affidavit, we got a signed statement from the judge's office that said no such document existed in our office. We can't give it to you. And they went through everything, all sorts of things in our office that had absolutely no. They searched women's purses. I mean, I have no idea what they thought they were going to find. They tried to cut off our surveillance cameras, but they were so inept they didn't know how to do it. They fortunately didn't try to cut the wires themselves, but they thought they had taken our router down, and they'd actually taken the backup DSL connection down, and they didn't understand the fiber optic connection that we had that was going in here. And so we benefited from some incompetence. But the big thing that, and this is changing about the world of journalism, people like Tim are much more common. And in fact, even for established newsrooms, there's a lot of places that are requiring, you know, working with outsourced people who are working on a gig basis for them, who are working out of their homes. The fact that we had an office, now most of our attention came from the home part of it, and I will be the first to admit, and I don't know whether she'd be happy or not about this, but you know, as any journalist knows, you want to get a human face on a story. We had a human face. We had my mother, and people related to that, and I think that kept our story alive a lot longer. And I kind of think, in a perverse way, she'd be happy about that. But it is terrible that, you know, so what if you've acquired information? I mean, the acquisition of information, if it's, you know, how to set off the nuclear bombs, if it's how to turn off the power grid, yeah, I can kind of see that the government has a stake of that. But acquiring information, whether it's for a journalist or an everyday citizen, is something that government should not be trying to stop. I understand in our case that they were alleging that it's a violation of personal privacy, but personal privacy now outweighs community interest in many people's minds. And in Tim's case, it really isn't even personal privacy. These are people who are establishing themselves as public figures, and they're what they do is a public, you know, quantity. I mean, we're looking at this type of attitude coming back to upend Times versus Sullivan. We're looking at this type of attitude upending many, many things that we depend on for press freedom.
Great. Tim, I assume that although your case may not have gotten the national attention that the case in Marion did, people in your professional orbit, other digital journalists, I would suppose are well aware of it. What kind of assumptions do you and other digital journalists make about what you are and are not allowed to do when you gather news online? And how has this case and the lack of answers about what you supposedly did wrong affected those assumptions and affected people's ability and willingness to gather news in the ways that you gather news?
Yeah, so when you make any request to a website, whether it be to request a video feed or a web page or whatever, and there's a very basic, sort of handshake interaction that happens. There's a request made, and the server decides whether or not it's going to give it to you. And if the server agrees to give you that content, that's the approval of a publicly of a web server that is configured to be accessible to the public. And if it's going to be the government's position that even if a web server is configured to be accessible to the public, you still have to have approval from the owner of that website to ask for that content, that's going to be devastating to the very concept of research. And we're very fortunate that similar cases involving CFAA and adjacent laws have been the civil liberties aspect has been pretty well preserved by the courts, but a lot of those things have been decided at the Circuit Court of Appeals level and haven't been approached by the Supreme Court yet. So my situation would be very, very different if I lived in a different state, because there have been decisions made by the circuit courts in those states that say that these things have to be given back. Let alone the aspect of we have a law that was passed that was specifically designed to prevent this from happening, and yet it happened. So that's sort of the how do you adjust what you're doing? And the reality is, so much of my work is in teaching other journalists how to identify where video feeds are and to watch them and to look at what I did on January 6th and how I was able to identify every single person, every single network, every single citizen journalist who was streaming video that day and be able to capture all of it. Well, now I'm put out of work, let alone that they took all of my computers and my phone, all of my storage and everything else. The very idea of going out and sharing with other journalists how to do this, I can't do, because I don't know that the federal government isn't taking the position that doing that itself is a crime, even if that video feed is public.
And even if, in our case, the information we obtained, we got it by asking the owner of the website how to get it, and fully disclosing what we were doing. I mean, it's a no-win situation. I mean, there's just no way to get it. And meanwhile, we have apps and other things that are taking all sorts of information about us and giving it to some corporate something or other somewhere to do whatever God only knows. We don't even know what it is they're doing with it. And they get away with it with regularity. It's your classic, if you're a big corporation, you can do it. And if you're a little guy, you can't.
Eric, we've touched on this a little already, but I wanted to talk more about the amount of attention your case got, which is sort of atypical for a press freedom story. You mentioned that your mother's tragic passing might have had something to do with it, and sure, that's true. But I think another component is that you were willing to talk about it. Many journalists don't want to become the story, even when in reality they are the story. They view reporting on press freedom issues as navel gazing or as insider stuff that nobody cares about. You don't seem to see it that way. Can you talk a bit about that?
This may be attributable to the fact that I spent 20 years in the business and then 25 years teaching journalism, that I kind of have a different view to it. And the fact that this isn't my livelihood. I don't take a salary here. I mean, I'm doing this for demonstration purposes and for community spirit. I mean, I'm trying to keep my old hometown alive and keep a newspaper in it alive. And so I don't have the normal motivations that some people might. I mean, if I decided that this didn't matter anymore, I'd just go lock the door and be done with it. So I don't care. I don't have that stake in it. I do feel uncomfortable writing about us. I do feel that we're pushing things a little bit far. But by the same token, we have a new audience. I mean, we've had so many people who have subscribed to our newspaper since this happened. They actually outnumber the people in our community, and they're wanting to read about this. So I'm serving that audience too. And I happen to believe, I have spent most of my life detesting public relations. I'm sorry, anybody who's a public relations professional out there. I used to show and have my bookshelf. I'd say, here's this row of books on journalism ethics, and then here's this little pamphlet called Public Relations Ethics, and you can hand it out. But number one lesson in public relations is tell your story. Don't, no comment. Don't hide it. Be the first to get out there and say what you're talking about. And, if you don't have anything to hide, why not report it? I mean, we have to hold ourselves up to the same scrutiny as we would hold anybody else up to. And if we did something wrong, I'd report that too. But the truth of the matter is, we didn't do anything wrong. So why would I want to hide and oh, well, this is I can't talk about this because this is my court. We have a deal with our attorney, Bernie Rhodes, who's a great attorney. Bernie doesn't tell me what to say. I may ask him sometimes if I think that, if I talk about this a little too much. There's actually something I withheld in a story Friday that I had second thoughts about withholding. And he tended to agree with me, but if he disagreed with me, I wouldn't have gone his way. I would have gone my own way. He just was a sounding board on that. There's nothing to hold back. We've spent most of the past 20 years writing about how journalism is dead and dying. Maybe it's time to write something about the struggle of it dying and what we're going to lose if it does die. Because if it does die, and if we don't make a case out of these things, there's going to be no reporting. There's going to be nothing. We're not going to know anything. And we're already in bad enough shape in terms of democracy with people not knowing what the issues are, not having examined them. My old specialty academically was looking into persuasion theory and some other things, and how people are swayed by slogans and images and other hot button issues if they didn't have perceived a personal interest and stake in it. Well, our job as journalists is to make sure they understand what that personal stake is. And then they start looking at facts. And when they look at facts, they will arrive at an answer. I don't know what their answer is going to be, but give them the opportunity to arrive at an answer based on facts, not based on opinions and images and whether it's liberal or conservative. And we've had the benefit of being accused of being horribly liberal and horribly conservative, and we've had great liberals and great conservatives both siding with us on this. And I remember getting messages that, this must be a bunch of damn Democrats who did this to you. And the literal next message was, this must have been a bunch of damn Republicans that did this to you. That's where we need to get. I mean, that's where the society needs to get. If we can get a little closer to it because of this, so much the better.
And Tim, I think you put your finger on one of the reasons why it's maybe difficult for journalists to cover your story at this point, which is that the government is not allowing further news to get out. The affidavit remains sealed, and there's not really a means for journalists to learn more about the case. Are there any other contributors, you think, to the reluctance of the press to cover your case? And, you know, if you were a journalist covering your own case, what would you be doing?
Well, I mean, certainly the fact that I'm an independent and digital journalist does contribute a great deal to that. My newsroom is, for my work, I'm publishing under myself or as a freelancer, but I don't have a publication, at least not a traditional publication. And so I think that there's just and it's natural and normal to have this sensation that, yeah, there's a difference between a person's home and a newsroom, and the newsroom is more sacred from a First Amendment standpoint. At the same time, as Eric knows, there's an incredible trauma to having your home searched, and to this day there's still because they went up in our attic, and so there's insulation from the attic all over the clothes in my closet. And now it's getting to be colder out, even though it's Florida, but I do have to go get a jacket or a stocking cap or something sometimes. And it's the first time since the raid, and so I'm climbing up on that shelf, and it's I had a stocking cap out for a holiday party this weekend. It was covered in insulation, right? The reminders are always there. So yeah, for me personally, it's a little hard to get on the outside of it, and also it was a little difficult, and I was very upset at some of the early coverage locally, because there was an assumption that a law enforcement activity at the home of a city councilwoman, it must be related somehow to some sort of corruption. And there was even a headline in the local paper that sort of implied that. And one of the few things I think the federal government has said publicly about my case is that it has nothing to do with my wife, right? Because they had to. But in my circumstance, it's my livelihood, it's my ability to earn a living, and it's my ability to continue sharing what I know about journalism with other journalists that has been brought to a standstill. I think that a lot of these details, in some ways, when this happens, Eric can certainly understand this. He just talked about the communications he has with his attorney. We are, when you are, you believe to be under some sort of criminal investigation, you're not supposed to, talk a lot about it, because you don't know what it is that you could say that could put you in some kind of jeopardy. But it's for that reason that lots of details about this haven't necessarily been covered very deeply. But at the same time, if you look at the search warrant, it's obvious from just looking at what was seized that there are things that were taken that have no relationship whatsoever to what was authorized to be taken by the search warrant. And I specifically pick up on those notebooks, because I'm very sensitive about that. It's essentially all of my reporting that I did during all of those years working for Gawker and Deadspin. There's some very sensitive things in there, names of confidential sources, in some cases stories that haven't even been reported yet that they took. But also at the same time, ask yourself, if you were a journalist looking at my circumstance, ask yourself, the federal government has seized all of your intimate text messages with your spouse and isn't giving you back your phone, even though the phone is not on the search warrant or alleged to be part of whatever it is that was involved here. That is putting yourself in my shoes, I guess, and it has been 7 months, and I'm moving steps and steps away from it, but you don't ever forget that this is where I am. And I would hope that some more people in the community would recognize that. What does this come down to? It comes down to a journalist revealed that one of the most popular entertainers in the world is an anti-Semite, and the government, for some reason, has decided to place him in a very bad situation, professionally, financially, reputationally, for having done that. And I go back to one of the things that was revealed by the prosecutor to my attorneys, that the FBI, when they were here in my newsroom, set up like a way to emulate how I would have edited the video so they could confirm that it was done here in my office. And I just think about those agents. I understand they're all just doing their jobs, but at the same time, you're an agent. You're sitting here, and at no point during the 8 hours or something that they were in this, I guess it was 10 hours that they were in this room, am I really trying to prosecute someone for exposing Kanye West as an anti-Semite? Is that why I got into the FBI? Because that's what this is about. But they also, there's a sign over here every time when they execute a search warrant, they go through the premises, every room gets tagged with a card with a letter and who's supposed to be in charge of signing it out, as in it's been completely searched and everything. In my case, they left the sign out sheet here and they never even signed in. They opened up my garage, which extends out to the alley. They opened up my garage when they got here. They never signed in or out. The sheet is still there. And when they left, the garage door was still open. I still don't, it's a garage. You're going to know when somebody came in and took something, like the next time that I need this certain kind of wrench and it won't be there. And I'll know that, oh, somebody came in and took this the day that the FBI came and left my garage door open, whatever. But those are the sort of things that I would look for people, to ask. You don't want people, I want my case to be covered as widely as possible so people understand that this is, this is not while my case may be political in nature, it's the politics of the individuals at those certain levels who are authorizing these things. It's not some kind of big federal Department of Justice conspiracy, as far as I know, that there's some sort of political bias in this. And much like, Eric, who were the first people to contact me with, condolences and what can we do after this? And I will say, I'm very transparently, on the left of the political spectrum online, but it was the chairperson of the Hillsborough County Young Republicans who reached out to me with condolences and saying that's garbage. I can't believe they did that. This, nobody, regardless of their politics, thinks that the government should be interfering in people's ability to do their jobs, the ability to communicate, and the ability to express their First Amendment rights.
Wouldn't it be nice to be able to go over to the FBI office, or in our case, the sheriff's office, and say, I want to search and see what you did with the stuff you got from us. And I'm going to search your office just like you searched mine. Why are they immune to that? Why do we not have any of that? And by the way, this is one of their evidence bags they left behind. We've got and our inventory of goods, they added a few things to after they left the copy for us. So it's just, it is obvious. And I think with Tim's case, 80% of the people will believe it has nothing to do with your significant other, but there's going to be 20% of the people who think that, even though it's been denied. And I think that's part of it. I think part of it is we just want to intimidate people that they shouldn't do these things. We don't think that this is something that they should be looking into. We don't think that this is something that we want. And we do it to intimidate. Why would it take 10 hours to figure out what goes on here? Why did it take 2.5? Why did they make my mother sit there for 2 hours being guarded so that 5 other people could come in? 7 people in the living room of a 98-year-old woman who weighed a third of what any of them did, trying to, they're worried about their safety with her. Why are they guarding her for that period of time? This is just pure stormtrooper stuff. This is way over the edge, and they do it because they think they can get away with it. They think they can get away with it. And if they can, God help us all. We're half a step away from they want to talk about worrying about anti-Semitism. This is how the greatest anti-Semitism of the world ever got started is through things of this nature. And I will say right now to Tim, you're saying you're leaning to the left. I have always classified myself as a conservative Republican. No, not the conservative Republican that people say is around today. But that's the nature of Kansas. And it goes. It's just pure intimidation. It really is. We look for all the motives and why they did it. Why they did it is because they can do it, and because they can squash somebody. They can make somebody shut up by intimidating them, and that's all there is to it. We I think spend way too much time trying to figure out what their motives are. Their motives are, I'm going to do this because I can do this. I can put a suspect in a chokehold. I can find a black guy walking on the street in a white neighborhood and harass him. I can do all these things, so I'm going to do them.
Tim, just one more aspect of your case I wanted to touch on before we get to Q&A, but one thing that we found particularly disturbing when we read the government's filings opposing your efforts to have the affidavit unsealed and get your stuff back was they're taking the position that you are not a journalist because you don't work for a traditional news outlet, because you don't have a website that says Tim Burke journalist, that your name wasn't on the bylines of some of the stories that your news gathering enabled. And that was a legal position the government didn't have to take. They could have just said, well, we did follow the Privacy Protection Act. We did treat him as a journalist, and here's why we were allowed to do what we did. And they could have made their case. Whether it's a good case or not, they could have made their case. But they chose to specifically cast doubt on whether you're a journalist, which it was sort of alarming to us. What was your take on that?
Yeah, so we haven't been able to ascertain what level of compliance that they kept with the Privacy Protection Act, because again, we haven't gotten a hearing. But the fact that they felt compelled to make an argument that I'm not a journalist suggests that they didn't follow it at all. And in fact, suggests that they didn't even take into account that I might be a journalist, because the Privacy Protection Act has a policy specifically defining what has to happen if there's a question of whether the subject of a search warrant is a journalist or not. And it's really bizarre because like they take this really narrow position and definition of what a journalist is, and it's basically discounts the idea that digital journalism exists at all. And it even after all of that, it ignores that I had a byline recently in our local newspaper about the radio station that carries the Tampa Bay Lightning game. So even in all of the bending over backwards to try to say, oh, he's not a journalist, they still weren't truthful in that filing. So, well, I shouldn't say they weren't truthful. They said we were unable to find. So if they didn't make any attempt to find, that would, I suppose, qualify with that. But it is very disturbing that the protections that are afforded. Now, I'll say this: the protections that are afforded to journalists should not be something that are just afforded to journalists. The protection from the government invading your life should extend to everyone. The First Amendment protections for that were established in New York Times v. Sullivan don't just apply to journalists; they apply to everyone. And so, I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea that journalists are somehow a protected class. But the reality is, this is the law as it was passed, and it was passed because the FBI was spying on journalists. It's there for a reason. And that the government is trying to say, oh, he's not a journalist, tells me that they did not pay any heed to even the very existence of that law. And again, we have both the Florida may have, many things that we're working on to try to improve down here. But Florida still has a very robust shield law protecting journalists. And we know from just what they seized that they were in violation of the Florida shield law, let alone the Privacy Protection Act. So yeah, I mean, you would think that as a journalist, there would be some level of concern that the government would just do these things and then try to claim that people aren't journalists, because, by the government's definition of what a journalist is, Ben Bradley at the Washington Post was not a journalist. Anybody who is an editor but doesn't have a byline isn't a journalist. Photojournalists are not journalists, according to the Department of Justice in the filings in my case. And I think we would all agree that's a truly ludicrous position to take.
We've got
I just want to add, as a traditional journalist, I agree 100% with everything Tim just said. The notion that I always revile at people who talk about journalists as the only protected class of people in the Constitution. Well, first of all, that's not true, but it shouldn't be. It's the public that has the right to express opinions and gather information and do all of those things. We are just an agent of them, and agents come in many forms and in many ways. And it is ludicrous to say that there's some that are doing that. But the law itself, the law that was written after the Stanford Daily case, probably made a mistake, and some of the shield laws probably made a mistake by talking about the journalists as if it were just journalists. Now, there are people who will abuse it. I've got a reader here who I'm sure would abuse the fact that she would consider herself a journalist, and she really isn't. It's hard to define what a journalist is, just like it's hard to define, what's pornography. Well, you can tell it when you see it, but you write a definition for it, and I don't know that you can. It really is important that we look at these as the people's rights, not journalists' rights.
Agreed. And we usually here look at it in terms of acts of journalism as opposed to professional journalists. You don't need to be a professional speaker to have freedom of speech. You don't need to have a congregation to have freedom of religion. There's no reason freedom of the press should be any different. And one question we got relatedly from the audience is about similarities between your two cases and the recent journalist arrests in Alabama. You two have likely read about those. Two journalists were arrested, a publisher and a reporter, for under a grand jury secrecy statute for writing about a grand jury subpoena. Of course, the statute by its literal terms does not apply to journalists. It applies to grand jury witnesses and others who are before the grand jury. We would have loved to have someone from that newspaper with us today, but a gag order was entered as a term of their bail that doesn't allow them to talk about the case. So we didn't even invite them. We don't want to, get them arrested again. After what you'd been through, what were your reactions? Whoever wants to respond to reading about that case.
I'll go first, because one of the papers I wrote in college was about the Paul Bernardo trial, which happened in St. Catharines, Ontario. And it was a case where there was a full media blackout. And so I wrote a great deal about how Buffalo news outlets that were just across the border were covering the case, and how people were buying up, Buffalo newspapers and smuggling them across the border so that people could get news about this case. And I said, this is the sort of thing that would never happen in the United States, because we have a freedom of the press. So when I read this story, that, first of all, attempting to prosecute publishing news, okay, and then the gag order that prevents, the idea of a gag order existing against journalists, I can't understand how. I don't understand how that works with what my understanding of the First Amendment was through all my years of journalism school and years of teaching about the First Amendment. I can't really synthesize that. I don't understand how that is happening in our country. And you say, well, I don't understand how my own situation is happening in this country. So I see it the same way.
I agree entirely. The gag order is ludicrous. I mean, it's been attempted in the United States before. There was a time when years and years ago, when I think it was Nebraska would hold reporters in contempt of court if they produced prejudicial pre-trial publicity of any sort. But we don't have the English system of justice that England and Canada and Australia do, that forbids you to cover those things. That's not our tradition. That's, we fought a revolution, and we were different from them. And why we want to reimpose it, it will make life easier for the bureaucrats. But at what point do they start saying, well, truth is no longer a defense for libel? My cat that I just hired, I just hired a cat. I named Zenger after John Peter Zenger, and because I think that's the next thing to be challenged, is that truth is no longer a defense in libel, and we really face a serious challenge of walking toward a much more controlled environment. And the problem is, it's controlling some aspects of society. We don't see them controlling Google or Meta or X or any of these other organizations that are allowed to do this, because the politicians have A, gotten lots of contributions from them, and B, have figured out how to use them to their own benefit. So they haven't figured out how to use the rest of us to their own benefit. So they figured, well, let's get rid of them, and we can use these other people, and we'll give them exemptions so they don't have to worry about what they write is true. They can just say, well, we're a common carrier. And the strange thing is, we journalists advocated that back 20, 30 years ago, not really knowing what it was that it was going to entail. And it's ended up screwing us.
One more question from the audience that we can get to before we conclude. And this one, I can briefly answer with my sort of, legal background, and if either you have anything to add. But there was a question about whether there's a step before a search warrant that should have occurred in Tim's case, but really in both of your cases, so you have time to defend, to respond and defend yourself. So what the Privacy Protection Act contemplates is a subpoena rather than a search warrant. A subpoena allows a journalist to appear in court with a lawyer and contest the legal basis for the subpoena, contest whether it's permissible under the First Amendment, under state or hopefully soon federal shield laws if the federal government passes one. So that should be the procedure, because when you have a warrant like you did in these two cases, Tim or Eric don't get a seat at the table when that warrant is issued. They don't get to go before the judge and say, hey, by the way, I'm a journalist, if whoever applied for this warrant didn't tell you that, which in Tim's case, we still don't know if they did. And I've got certain rights that need to be taken into consideration. Now, we're for drastically limiting when journalists can be compelled to disclose sources under a subpoena or a search warrant. That being said, to the extent that there are any circumstances where the First Amendment can tolerate a journalist being searched or compelled to disclose sources or news gathering materials, a subpoena has the advantage of allowing the journalist to respond. Is that, have you had any conversations about why that hasn't happened in your case, or any thoughts on how the process should have worked if there were something legitimate?
The process really, I mean, there are protections. The police want to seek, the law enforcement officers want to seek something. It's supposed to go to a prosecutor who has prosecutorial discretion, who's supposed to understand these things. Then it goes from there to a judge who is supposed to decide whether this has justice. There are two safeguards that it got through. And as much as I like to say that, we're screwed as journalists, the one who was really screwed in our raids was Vice Mayor Ruth Herbel. She had received the same document that we had. She'd sent it to the city administrator and told the city administrator where she got it. What were they searching her home for? She'd already disclosed it. She'd already said where she got it from. She said everything that they could obtain information from searching her home for. Why would they allow them to go to her home? unless it was purely, we want to show you that the stormtroopers can come here anytime they want to and stand in your doorway. Now, there's no National Association of Vice Mayors out there to protect her, but that's an even more egregious violation of the Fourth Amendment. Forget the First Amendment. What is the point of a search warrant? Is that you're going to discover something. Now, you don't give a subpoena. You don't say, "Hey, Dillinger, we think you have $20 million you robbed from the bank stashed away in your house. Can we come look for it and get a subpoena?" I mean, you're going to catch somebody with something. Well, what were they going to catch us with? What were they going to catch Ruth Herbel with? It wasn't even whether it's a journalistic right or it's just an abuse of the Fourth Amendment, much in addition to the First Amendment. But I really think the Fourth Amendment challenges are more persuasive than the First Amendment challenges in some cases here.
Yeah, and in addition to those two forms of protection, there's a third one after the fact, in which at the federal level, you can contest and have a search warrant quashed if you're able to show that the affidavit was in some way deficient, in a way that if the magistrate judge were to have all the facts of the case, would not have approved the search warrant in the first place. We are denied that legal avenue because we don't have access to the affidavit, and the government won't show it. But you talk about the Fourth Amendment. In my case, I said it's the First, Fourth, and the Fifth. Because the government said, "Oh, we'll give you back your phone if you give us the unlock code to it." So, okay, 1, 3, 1, 4, 5. At what point are you going to ask, like, if the agents can come, sleep in our spare bedroom tonight? We're running down the whole list of my Bill of Rights that I feel like are being violated here.
It's like the Third Amendment or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
But in our case, the county attorney withdrew the search warrant after the fact. Now, the argument that they've made before is, well, we're just going to approve all the search warrants. It doesn't matter, because you can always go to court and challenge the results of the search warrant, whether the search was legal. What happens if there's never any charges filed? You have no way. You have no way back from this unless you sue, and suing is not cheap. I mean, we're lucky enough that we've got a libel policy, and the libel policy covered seizures. So our attorney bill is being covered at this point. Somebody like Tim, unless you really thought about this, and I kind of doubt it because I wouldn't have if I were in your position, where do you go to get this kind of resources? There's a mantra going around government these days that everything is legal until somebody sues about it. Well, that's great if everybody has equal ability to sue. They don't. I mean, the average citizen doesn't have any idea how to, or the wherewithal to be able to afford to hire attorneys that charge more in an hour than they earn in a week.
Thanks to both of you, and I'm sorry y'all we're out of time. I haven't gotten to all of the questions that were posted in the Q&A, but we will keep them in mind and possibly try to cover them in some of our future writing about the case. One question about the specifics of Tim's case and what he believes may have been the act that the DOJ are attempting to criminalize in terms of how he accessed the site. You can look at our letter that we sent to the DOJ, which I think has been posted in the chat, and that will give you some background on really what Tim suspects the basis for the investigation might be, because I don't think anybody actually knows. But other questions we will attempt to answer in future writings if we haven't in the past. So please stay tuned, check our website. We blog regularly. We cover both of these cases whenever the opportunity arises, and social media as well. Thanks again to both of you for your time today. I know, Eric, you're getting other media inquiries as we talk, so I appreciate you making the time, and Tim as well. I'm sure you've got plenty of other things to do, so much appreciated. And thanks to all for coming out. Great conversation. Hopefully we'll see you at our next event.
And thanks to your organization and you personally and everyone involved in keeping this attention going on this. This is very important to do. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of the Freedom of the Press Foundation with your support from the beginning. It's been this is a very difficult emotional thing to experience, but having the backing of organizations like yours has lifted my spirits.
Good to know that we're able to help. Thanks, everyone.